So Gen 5 drives are here, and today I'm going to be checking out the T700 from Crucial, which is absolutely blistering fast. It has read speeds of up to 12,400 megabytes per second and write speeds of up to 11,800 megabytes per second. It comes in three different capacities. There's 1, 2 and 4 terabytes. And again, it comes both with and without a heatsink in each of those capacities and has a 5-year limited warranty. So in this video, I'm going to be unboxing the drive, showing you how to install it, and then we'll be doing some benchmarks. So I've got the 2 terabyte version that comes with the heatsink, and this is a pretty beefy heatsink on the drive because the Gen 5 drives do run pretty hot. So I'm now going to show you how to install the drive in the system. The first thing to say is make sure your motherboard supports a Gen 5 drive or you're wasting your money. And again, look at the motherboard manual and find out which slot is your Gen 5 slot. So for us, it's this top slot here. So the clue that the Gen 5 drives are going to run much hotter than Gen 4 drives is this is the Gen 5 heatsink that ASRock include with the motherboard. It's got an actively cooled fan in it, and it is absolutely massive. So what I'm going to be doing is testing out the heatsink that comes with the drive, the heatsink that's installed in the motherboard by default, and then this actively cooled heatsink to see does it make any difference. So first thing to do is remove the motherboard heatsink from our Gen 5 slot, and it's held on with 2 screws. So we can then set our drive into the socket, flatten it down and secure it with a screw from the motherboard box. Some other motherboards will have a little clip rather than a screw you can use to secure your drive. So when we first load up Windows and go to this PC, our Gen 5 drive won't be appearing. That's normal whenever you install a new drive into the PC. I've got our 2 Gen 4 drives installed already. So what we need to do is go down to the bottom and type in Disk Management, and the Create and Format Hard Disk Partitions will come up. So we'll click on it. When we do, we're going to get this pop-up telling us we need to initialize our drive. So we're going to click on OK. And then if we scan down to find our drive, it's going to show up initially as unallocated space. So what we need to do is right click on this and click New Simple Volume, click Next, Next. If we want to change the letter of the drive, we can do it from here from the pull down menu. Click Next. We can name our drive to what we want and then click Next and Finish. Okay, and then if we head back to this PC, we can see our drive is now appearing and we can add files to it. So I pulled up Hardware Monitor and we can take a look at the temperatures of our 3 drives. So this is our Gen 5 drive. We can see at the moment it's idling, there's nothing happening on it, and it's sitting at 39 degrees. Our Data Legend is where I've installed our operating system and it's currently running at 34 degrees. So this drive is actually hotter with nothing happening on it compared to the operating system. And over here, we've got another Gen 4 drive, which is sitting at a nice cool 26 degrees. So you can compare the difference. Gen 4 drive idling with nothing happening, Gen 5 drive idling with nothing happening. There's quite a difference in the temperatures. So what I'm going to do now is a CrystalDiskMark Benchmark to see what speed the drive will actually run at. I've selected our Gen 5 drive, and importantly, I'm going to be keeping a little look at the temperatures during the test. Okay, so that's the benchmark complete, and actually we're pretty close to what the manufacturers say this drive should do. The read speed's meant to be up to 12,400, and we're pretty close to that, and our write speed's meant to be 11,800. So it's pretty much doing what it should be doing. In terms of the temperatures, the maximum temperature it hit during the test was 67 degrees. So that's actually pretty good. The heatsink's doing a good job for this fairly short test. The important numbers are 82 degrees and 90 degrees. At 82 degrees, the drive will start to thermal throttle, and at 90 degrees, the drive will shut down. So that's why it's important. Crucial do recommend you have a good heatsink on the drive. So I think to put the numbers here into context and also the temperatures into context, I'm going to repeat the test with one of our Gen 4 drives. Okay, so that's the benchmark complete. If I bring up our previous results with the Gen 5 drive, we can see that our sequential read speeds are significantly slower. The Gen 5 drive was 1.9 times quicker. And if we look at our write speeds, it's even quicker here by 3 times. So while our sequential read and write speeds are really impressive, the random speeds aren't quite as impressive. And in fact, when we compare the random read and write speeds, the Gen 4 drive is actually the winner. Taking a look at the temperatures, we can see that our drive reached a maximum of only 38 degrees. This has been cooled by the standard motherboard heatsink. So while the benchmarks are useful, the next thing I want to do is some real world testing to see how much of a benefit we get from this Gen 5 drive. So I've plugged in my external USB drive. It's a Samsung T5 drive, and this is where I normally record directly onto for my Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K when I'm making a video. So I've got my video files, and I've also got some audio files as well as a few additional files for making this project. So what I'm going to do is select all the files, we're going to copy those, and then we'll paste them onto the T5 drive. So I'm not expecting a big improvement in terms of speed, because I think the bottleneck here is actually going to be the T5 drive. But what I'm actually interested in is what the temperature is over a more prolonged use of the drive. Okay, so that's all our files transferred over. Speed-wise, it was exactly the same as what I was getting transferring files to my Gen 4 drive, because as I mentioned, the bottleneck is not the Gen 4 drive, it's the external SSD that I'm using. In terms of our temperatures, maximum temperature during the transfer test, which took around about 15 minutes, was 64 degrees, so well away from the thermal throttling limit of 82 degrees with the included heatsink. So now what I want to do is copy all the files from the Crucial drive to the Gen 4 drive to see what sort of speeds we're getting. So obviously we're going to be limited by the speed of the Gen 4 drive, because I've only got one Gen 5 drive in the system. Okay, so that's all our files transferred over. The maximum temperature here was 62 degrees, so the most we've got is 64 in transferring files, so well below the thermal throttling limit. In terms of speed, I didn't get really any advantage in speed compared to using two Gen 4 drives, because the Gen 4 drive is the bottleneck. So what we have now, we've got exactly the same files on a Gen 4 and a Gen 5 drive, which is perfect because we can test the video editing performance. So that's the video rendered. It's about a 22-minute video in Blackmagic RAW, and it took 4 minutes and 52 seconds to render the 4K video. So the first time I ran it, I had all the files saved on one Gen 4 drive and wrote the files to another. And the second time I used the same drive for both reading the files and writing the files too. And interestingly, there was no difference at all, which is going to be quite useful because I've got all the files saved on our Gen 5 drive, and I'm also going to be writing to our Gen 5 drive to see is it any quicker. In terms of our temperatures, the maximum temperatures for our Gen 4 drives were 36 and 41 during that process. And we can see currently our Gen 5 drive is running at 48. So what I'm going to do is open the exactly the same project I've got saved in Gen 5. We're going to export it this time to the Gen 5 drive as well. And I'm going to use exactly the same settings I did the last time. Okay, so that's our video rendered, and disappointingly the time is exactly the same with all the files on the Gen 5 drive and writing to the Gen 5 comparing to having exactly the same project with all the files on the Gen 4 drive and writing to the Gen 4 drive. So that is a little bit disappointing. In terms of our temperatures, they're nothing scary. The maximum the drive reached during the test was 55 degrees. So it really seems to be the benchmarks are actually giving us the highest speeds and as well the highest temperatures. But real world use of the drive, the temperatures seem well controlled by the included heatsink. So I was really quite surprised with the video editing results, because this was an area I was really expecting the Gen 5 drive to shine. And after racking my brain as to why this could be, the only thing I could come up with was that actually I wasn't really pushing DaVinci Resolve hard enough with the files I was using or the way I was exporting the project. So the way to push things a little bit further was to run the Puget benchmark for DaVinci Resolve, which is quite an extreme test. It looks at a whole variety of different media up to 8K and takes about 20 minutes to complete the test. So that's exactly what I did. Now, because I wanted just to run this on the Gen 5 drive, I did a clean install of Windows on the Gen 5 drive, removed all the other drives from the system, so there was only the one drive, the Gen 5 drive, in the system when I ran the benchmark. So it was the full extended benchmark that I ran, and our overall score was 2068. And during that test, like I say, it was about 20 minutes long. The maximum temperature that we got on the drive was 55 degrees with the standard motherboard heatsink in place. If we take a look at our full results, and I also ran this on the Gen 4 drive, with it being the only drive installed in the system. So comparing the results, there was actually a slight benefit with the Gen 5 drive now. So we had a 1.6% improvement in our extended overall score. And in terms of the standard overall score, it went up by 2%. We can see there was a slight bump in our 4K media score. The 8K media score remained unchanged. And again, also a slight bump in the GPU effects and the Fusion score. So I'll put the raw results up on the screen so you can pause the video if you want to take a closer look at them. So I am keen to show you the difference between the different types of heatsink, but with the previous CrystalDiskMark test, we didn't really get the temperatures of the SSD pushed up enough to be able to compare the differences. So I'm going to run it again. I'm probably going to run it in a serial loop to see what we can get the temperature up to. But to make it more realistic, I've got currently IDA64 running where we're just stressing the GPU, and our GPU is running at 100%, and that's going to be putting quite a bit of heat around the SSD, and it's probably a more realistic test with other components in the system being stressed. I'm not stressing the CPU because I don't want to affect the running of the benchmark. So we'll go ahead and start the CrystalDiskMark, and we'll probably run it in a series of loops to see how many it takes to get this up towards its maximum temperature. Okay, that's the first run over. I'm just going to get straight into a second run. We're up at 72 degrees, and we'll get straight into the third run. Okay, so that's the third run completed. In terms of the performance numbers, they're down very slightly from our first run, but not significantly, and the maximum temperature we've reached is 80 degrees. And we head over to the IDA64 stability test, you can see the trend that we had in terms of the temperatures. So what I'm going to do now is let the drive cool down a little bit, and then we'll change the heatsink. So in terms of removing the heatsink, we've got 2 screws in the top and 2 in the bottom. And then we can sort of pry the heatsink apart slightly, and the middle bit is going to come out. And then we can remove our drive. So if you do buy the heatsink version of the drive, it's not a good idea to remove it. You can see this thermal material we've got on the back, which is broken up into lots of little pieces, and I had to give this a good clean to get it all off the drive itself. So I'm not simply going to be able to put this back on. So unless you have all the right materials to put it back together, it's probably not a good idea to take it apart. But I'm doing this today to see which of the heatsinks is actually better, so you'll know which version of the drive to go for. And I'm going to start off with the standard motherboard heatsink, and if you're using it from new, there'll be some plastic protection on the back of the heat pad on the back that you're going to need to remove. So we'll go ahead and run the 3 rounds of CrystalDiskMark again and see what the temperature gets up to. Okay, so that's the third run completed, and the maximum temperature we've got to is 75. I'll give you a quick look at the temperature trends in IDA64. So with that, actually, that's much better than the 80 degrees we were getting with the heatsink that came with the SSD. So I think the lesson from this, provided you've got a decent motherboard heatsink in place, you don't need to pay the extra for the additional heatsink. But it is important to say this is a really premium motherboard that I have, and it's a really nice heatsink that I have on it. So cheaper motherboards might not do as good a job as this. So let's take it to the next level. We'll let the SSD cool down, and then we'll go for the really beefy heatsink. So I've not used this heatsink before, so I can remove the plastic protection from the heat pad, and then we can line it up with the SSD. So as I've said, this is an actively cooled heatsink, so we're going to need to plug the fan into a header on the motherboard. And then we can just tuck the excess cable to the back of the case. Okay, heading over to your motherboard BIOS, our heatsink is plugged into chassis fan number 6, and we can see the revs per minute here. If we head down to the settings, we'll change it over to PWM mode. It's currently running the silent profile. Let's run standard mode. Unfortunately, we have an option to change it to run off the SSD temperature. It's a choice between motherboard and CPU. So for the purpose of this test, because we are going to be constantly stressing the drive, I'm just going to run it at 100%. It will be quite noisy and you wouldn't do it, but it's going to give us a good example of just how good a job this heatsink can do when it's turned up. And really, there should be an option in the motherboard BIOS here to run this off the SSD temperature. So we'll run it at full speed. Okay, so that's IDA64 up and running. We're currently stressing our GPU. So let's go ahead and start the CrystalDiskMark benchmarks. Okay, so that's the end of the third run and the temperatures are incredibly impressive. We had a maximum of 67. If I show you the IDA64 stability results, it's actually a pretty straight trace, going up when they were doing each of the tests and dropping down again, but it's not going up with each graph like the previous tests did. So this shows you that the actively cooled heatsink, it does an absolutely brilliant job. It was 8 degrees better at the end compared to the standard motherboard heatsink and 13 degrees better than the heatsink that comes with the SSD. So if you were doing lots of really long, high intensity tasks, getting an actively cooled heatsink is a good idea. You're not going to get these same temperature results unless you run the fan at 100%, which I wouldn't recommend doing because it is very noisy. Okay, final thing to test, and don't try this one at home. I've removed the heatsink from the SSD altogether, so it's currently in the PC without any heatsink on it. And Crystal do not recommend you do this. They say you need a heatsink on it to get the optimum performance, but our drive should thermal throttle and thermal shutdown before it develops any harm, so hopefully I'm not going to damage the hardware by doing this. So let's head into IDA64, and you can see since I've removed the heatsink that the temperature has already started to rise without any activity on the drive at all. So let's go ahead and see what happens when we run CrystalDiskMark. And I think this time actually I'm going to leave the IDA64 open as well. Okay, so we've got everything open on the screen. So we're already jumping up to 84, where our drive should be starting to thermal throttle above 82. So we're going to probably notice our results are going to start to go down. And this is actually, we can see just the fourth pass that we have done. And look, the drive is shut down to 32 degrees. So I'm just going to stop this and restart it again. It looks like our benchmark had frozen. So let's try again. Okay, so let's try that again. So we can see in this second time we're getting significant thermal throttling now. Our speeds are probably about half of what they were before. The 32 degrees here is probably not accurate. Over here we're getting temperatures currently at 84 degrees, and above 82 it will thermal throttle and will thermal shut down after 90 degrees. So I'm actually going to go ahead and stop the benchmark here. I don't think there's any need to stress the drive any further. We could see really quickly it thermal throttles and the performance drops to round about half. Okay, so time to sum up on the Crucial T700. So in terms of the benchmarks, a really impressive drive. It was 1.9 times as fast as the Gen 4 SSD I tested against in terms of read speeds, and 3 times as fast in terms of write speeds. So absolutely incredible potential. So the only side issue for me in terms of real use for the drive, I didn't get really any significant benefits in terms of what I use it for. In terms of video editing, copying large files, there was other bottlenecks in the system in terms of either hardware or software that meant I wasn't able to get the full potential from the drive. In terms of gaming, looking at other people's benchmarks, something I didn't test today, you're maybe saving 1 to 2 seconds in your game load times, and even with direct storage, there wasn't really massive benefits at the moment. So I think there's absolutely brilliant potential with this drive going forward, certainly with the direct storage and gaming, but at the moment it's not going to offer significant benefits over a Gen 4 drive unless you're running benchmarks all day. In terms of the temperatures, this was certainly something I was quite worried about when I was getting all the motherboards with the really beefy heatsinks and actively cooled heatsinks. But provided you've got a heatsink on the drive, you don't really need to worry about it. I couldn't get this drive to thermal throttle with any sort of heatsink on it. So if you don't have a decent heatsink on your motherboard, pick up the version with the heatsink. If you do have a decent heatsink, you can probably save yourself a little bit of money and get the version without the heatsink. So looking forward to getting this into a few of the builds going forward. And like I say, I imagine as time goes on, we're going to be getting more and more benefits from the speeds that this drive can offer us. So hopefully you have enjoyed this video. If you have, please remember to give me a thumbs up. And if you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button as well. Thanks for watching.